said the man at the feed supply counter, setting down his clipboard and looking at her over the rim of his glasses. "Are you absolutely certain you want 40 beehives delivered to a wheat field?" Norma Calloway didn't look up from the order form she was signing. 42, she said. "I wrote 42. He checked his clipboard again. "Right, 42. He paused. "That's a lot of bees for a wheat operation." "Yes," she said, and slid the form back across the counter. That was the spring of 1974. Norma was 38 years old, and she had just made a decision that would cause her neighbors in Renfrew County, Ontario, to question her sanity for the next 7 years. She drove home on the county road with the windows down past fields that had just been turned over, the smell of wet clay coming up from the ditches. The farm her husband's family had run since the 1930s stretched out on both sides of a low hill. Flat land, good land, the kind that grew hard red wheat reliably and without complaint. Her father-in-law had built the grain silos himself. Her husband Stuart had repaired them twice. The land knew what it was for, and everyone in the county agreed on that point. Everyone except Norma. She had been keeping bees on a small scale since she was a girl, a handful of hives behind her parents' house near Pembroke. Her mother's people had come from the Niagara Peninsula, where orchards and apiaries went together the way rain and mud went together, as natural as anything. But wheat country was different. Wheat didn't need pollination the way fruit did. Wheat was wind-pollinated. Everybody knew that. The neighbors knew that, the co-op knew that, and Stuart, God rest his patient soul, had known that too, which was why he'd said, very carefully, when she first mentioned it 3 years earlier, "Norma, I understand what you're thinking, but I'm not sure the timing is right." Stuart passed away in February of 1973, leaving Norma with 412 acres, 2 grown children who lived in Ottawa, a 1968 John Deere that needed a new head gasket, and a farm debt that the bank had been very polite about for exactly 1 year. The wheat was fine. The wheat was always fine, right up until it wasn't. The summer of 1973 had been a reasonable year, but the prices at the grain elevator had dropped for the 3rd consecutive season, and Norma had spent enough evenings at the kitchen table with a pen and a ledger to understand that reasonable years were not going to be enough. The farm needed something else, a second income, a hedge. She had been thinking about bees for a long time. Not just any bees, and not just for honey. What she had in mind was more deliberate than that. A commercial apiary operation, licensed and scaled, producing clover honey and canola honey for the specialty market that was just beginning to open up in the early 1970s, as urban consumers started paying attention to where their food came from. She had read everything she could find on the subject. She had written to an apiarist in the Fraser Valley and received back a letter 4 pages long, full of practical detail, from a man who had been running 200 hives alongside a grain operation for 15 years and said it had saved his farm twice over. She had done the numbers. The numbers made sense. What didn't make sense to anyone else was doing it here, on wheat land, in Renfrew County, where it hadn't been done before. The first person to laugh was her brother-in-law Aldous, who farmed the adjacent property and had opinions about everything. He heard about the order from someone at the feed supply. Word traveled in Renfrew County the way it always had, which was fast and with embellishment, and he drove over one evening in late April, sat down at her kitchen table, and told her she was making a mistake. "Wheat doesn't need bees," he said, "for what would not be the last time." "I know that," Norma said. She poured him coffee. "Then what's the point? The clover in the field margins, the canola across the road, the wildflower corridors along the creek. There's forage here, Aldous. There's more forage on this property than in half the orchards in Niagara." He looked at her the way men sometimes looked at her when she said things they hadn't thought of themselves. Not quite dismissive, not quite convinced, settling somewhere in the uncomfortable middle. He drank his coffee. He drove home. The next morning, 3 of his friends from the grain co-op knew about the bees. By the time the first hives were delivered in May, the story had acquired details that Norma hadn't provided. 42 hives had become 100 hives, maybe more. The Fraser Valley letter had become some American she's been writing to. There was a version going around that she planned to tear out the south field entirely and plant it with flowers, which was not true, but which people repeated with the confident authority of those who have heard something from someone reliable. Norma listened to all of it at the hardware store, at the post office, at the church potluck in June, and she said very little. She had always been a quiet woman, not shy exactly, but economical, with words in the way that people who do a lot of reading sometimes are. She knew what she was doing, or she knew it as well as anyone could know something they were attempting for the first time at scale. She had the letter from the man in Fraser Valley. She had the numbers in her ledger. She had the memory of her grandmother's kitchen in summer, the jars of amber honey lined up on the sill like small suns. She set up the hives in 4 rows along the eastern margin of the property, where a windbreak of old Manitoba maples offered some protection. She built the extracting shed herself over 2 weekends in June, with help from her younger daughter Ellen, who had driven up from Ottawa and spent the whole time asking questions that Norma answered patiently and completely. Ellen was 22 and worked at a government office and had no particular interest in farming, but she had her mother's habit of wanting to understand how things worked. "What does the honey actually taste like?" Ellen asked on the second Sunday, handing her mother boards as she worked. "Depends on what they're foraging. Clover is mild, almost vanilla. Canola sets hard, fast, granulates. Wildflower is complex. You get something different every year depending on what's blooming." Norma paused to check a measurement. "That's part of what I want to document. What's actually growing in the margins here, what the bees prefer, what the honey profile ends up being." Ellen was quiet for a moment. "You've been thinking about this for a long time, haven't you?" "Since your father got sick," Norma said. "Maybe before." The first full season went the way first seasons go. Imperfectly, instructively. She lost 6 hives to varroa pressure she hadn't caught early enough, a painful and expensive lesson. The honey yield was lower than projected because the summer turned dry in July and the clover didn't bloom as long as it should have. She extracted 240 pounds in the first year, against a projection of 400. At the grain co-op that fall, Aldis's friend Colin Marsh, who ran the largest wheat operation in the northern part of the county and had built a reputation for directness that he sometimes confused with wisdom, told Norma that he'd heard the first year hadn't gone well. "It went the way first years go," she said. "Maybe you'd be better off putting that land back into production." "The land isn't in the hives, Colin. The hives are on the margin." He shrugged the way people shrug when they've already decided they're right. "Still, bees on a wheat farm." He said it the way you'd say dancing in a hardware store. A thing that was technically possible but communicated a fundamental misunderstanding of where you were. She drove home and checked on the hives and wrote in her ledger and did not think about Colin Marsh for the rest of the evening. The second year was better. The third year was better still. By 1977, she was running 68 hives and producing just over 900 pounds of honey annually, which she sold through a specialty grocer in Ottawa and a small health food distributor who had started asking whether she could double her supply. The honey had developed a reputation, partly because of the terroir of the Renfrew County margins, partly because of how she handled the extraction, cold and slow, and partly because she had started labeling each batch by dominant forage, which the urban buyers found interesting in a way that surprised her and then didn't. The wheat was still the backbone. She was clear about that. But the bees were covering the equipment costs, and in one good year, they had covered the equipment costs and half a payment on the silo repair. The numbers in the ledger were telling a different story than they had in 1974. Nobody mentioned this at the co-op. What they mentioned was the summer of 1978, when Norma had a hive collapse event that took out 11 colonies over 3 weeks. It was a rough year for beekeepers across the province, a combination of a wet spring and a particularly bad pesticide drift issue from a farm 2 properties over that she was never fully able to prove but was reasonably certain about. She lost the 11 hives. She restocked the following spring. It cost her. The story that went around the county was that the bee operation had failed. Aldis came by in September, not unkindly, and told her that there was no shame in trying something and having it not work out. His wife had sent a pie, which was sitting on the passenger seat of his truck. "It hasn't stopped working," Norma said. She was standing in the yard with her arms crossed, not because she was angry, but because it was a cool evening and she hadn't put on a jacket. 11 hives, though. "I have 57 left. I'm restocking in May." He looked at her for a moment. "Norma, the operation isn't over, Aldis. I had a difficult year. Farmers have difficult years. He took the pie inside for her anyway, and she thanked him for it, and they had tea and didn't talk about the bees anymore. But she knew what he was thinking, because she knew Aldous, and she knew he was going to tell people that she was being stubborn, that she was too proud to admit it wasn't working. She went back out to the hives after he left, and stood there in the early dark, listening to the quieter, slower sound of colonies that were getting ready to cluster for winter. 57 hives, 4 years of learning. The ledger sitting on the kitchen table with numbers that told a complicated story but not a hopeless one. She thought about her grandmother, Anna, who had kept bees on a small farm outside of Queenston for 40 years. Anna had talked about bees the way some people talked about weather or scripture, as something larger than yourself that you had to pay attention to and work with, not control. She had a German word she used sometimes, Bienenfach, the bee folk, as if the colony was a people unto itself with its own logic and its own needs. Norma had grown up half understanding this and had arrived, in her late 30s, at a fuller understanding. The bees knew things. You had to slow down enough to learn from them. She went inside and looked at the ledger and made a note about the pesticide drift and decided she would write to the provincial apiculture office in the morning. The years between 1978 and 1981 were the hard middle of the story, the part that doesn't make for a clean narrative because nothing dramatic happens, no catastrophe, no triumph, just work, just the slow, unglamorous process of learning to run a real apiary on top of running a wheat farm, managing both with the help of a part-time hired hand named Pete, who was 17 when he started and 20 when he left for college. And later a woman from Cobden named Irene, who knew bees better than anyone Norma had ever met, and who stayed for 4 seasons. The wheat prices recovered somewhat. The honey operation stabilized. Norma was producing just over 1,000 pounds in good years, 1,400 in excellent years. She had a waiting list with the Ottawa distributor. She was also, quietly, doing something else. In 1979, she had begun planting the creek margins and the field edges systematically, not flowers exactly, not a garden, but a deliberate mix of native plants chosen for their bloom times and their forage value. Phacelia in early spring when the hives were hungry and there was little else blooming. Wild bergamot and joe pye weed for the summer gap. Goldenrod and aster for fall buildup. She had worked this out partly from reading, partly from watching where the bees actually went, and partly from a conversation she'd had in 1980 with a retired professor of botany from the University of Ottawa who had come through the county on a survey project and stopped at her farm on the recommendation of someone she'd never met. His name was Dr. Bernard Tull, and he was in his 70s and walked with a cane and knew more about native plant communities in eastern Ontario than anyone Norma had encountered. He spent an afternoon walking her margins with her, and at the end of it he stopped at the edge of the creek and said, very quietly, "Mrs. Calloway, do you understand what you've built here?" She said she thought she was beginning to. "This is a functional pollinator corridor," he said. "Continuous bloom from April through October, on a wheat farm." He shook his head, not in disbelief, but in something closer to appreciation. "I've been looking at agricultural land in this province for 40 years. I have not seen this done deliberately on a grain operation, not once." Norma didn't say anything. She looked out at the margin, which in late August was thick with goldenrod, buzzing with sound. "You should document this," he said, "properly." She had already been doing that, in her own way, in the ledger and in the notebooks she kept by hive. But she understood what he meant, and so in 1981 she began keeping more formal records, bloom dates, forage observations, honey profiles matched to plant communities, colony strength correlated with margin diversity. She did not tell anyone at the co-op about this. In 1982, the federal government cut its agricultural support programs in ways that hit small and mid-size grain operations particularly hard. Interest rates in Canada that year reached levels that made borrowing for farm equipment feel like a form of optimism that bordered on recklessness. Several farms in Renfrew County changed hands. The grain elevator reduced its hours. There were conversations at the co-op that Norma listened to carefully and without comment. Men who had been farming the same land their fathers had farmed, trying to understand what was happening to a way of life that had always been difficult, but had never felt quite so precarious. Colin Marsh sold his East Field, Aldous had a bad year on top of 2 other bad years and took out a loan that he told Norma about one evening in a way that made it clear he was not asking for advice but needed to tell someone. Norma's farm was not untouched. She deferred 2 equipment purchases. She and Irene drove the extraction shed hard that summer, working late into evenings, taking every frame they could. But the diversification she had built over 8 years was, in the language of the ledger, performing. The honey income was not enormous. It was not dramatic, but it was consistent in a way the wheat income hadn't been for several years, and in 1982, consistent was the rarest and most valuable thing a farm in Ontario could be. She didn't say this out loud. She kept doing the work. The year that changed things was 1981, though Norma wouldn't understand it completely until later. That was the year she was contacted, through Dr. Taff Tull, who had mentioned her work to a colleague, by a researcher at the Ontario Agricultural College in Guelph who was studying pollinators and agricultural margins. The researcher, a young woman named Dr. Pros Brisach's Sarah Hewitt, drove up to the farm in October and spent 2 days walking the property and asking questions that Norma answered carefully and at length. Dr. Hewitt was quiet in the field and thorough in her questions, and at the end of the second day said something that Norma had not expected. "We'd like to include your farm in a study," she said, "on managed pollinator habitat in grain-producing regions. We think what you've documented here could be significant." Norma was standing at the kitchen sink washing cups. She turned around. "How significant?" "Potentially very," Dr. Hewitt said. The study took 3 years. It was published in 1984 in a journal that most people in Renfrew County had never heard of, but which was read by people in the Federal Agriculture Ministry and by extension officers and by a small number of farmers who paid close attention to that kind of thing. The paper described what Norma had built in careful scientific language: continuous bloom coverage, reduced colony stress, improved overwintering outcomes, documented yield correlation, and presented the Callaway farm as a case study in what the paper called integrated pollinator management on a mixed grain apiary operation. She received a copy of the paper in the mail and read it at the kitchen table slowly. She was 50 years old. The co-op didn't read the paper, but the extension officer did, and he mentioned it to the County Agricultural Committee, and the County Agricultural Committee mentioned it at a meeting in Renfrew in the spring of 1985. And Aldous was at that meeting and came home and drove straight to Norma's farm and sat down at her kitchen table for the second time in 10 years and looked at her across the table with an expression she hadn't seen on his face since the funeral. "They were talking about your farm," he said, "at the committee meeting. The extension officer showed them something, a university paper." Norma was quiet. "He said that the margins, the planting you've done along the creek, he said it's being studied, that people at Guelph have been looking at it." She nodded. "Since when?" "Since 1981, she said. "The study was published last year." Aldous was quiet for a long time. Outside, the April evening was still and cool, and somewhere out beyond the barn, the first early hives were already working the phacelia she'd planted along the fence line in March. "You've known for a year," he said, not accusatory, just sorting it out. "I've known for longer than that," she said gently. "I've known since about 1977 that it was working. I didn't need the paper to tell me. But I'm glad it was written." He looked at his hands. Aldous was not a man who apologized easily. Not because he was hard-hearted, but because he came from people who expressed accountability through action rather than words. People who showed up with pies and fence repairs and didn't say the thing they were actually trying to say. But he was quiet long enough that she understood what the quiet meant. "I told people it wouldn't work," he said finally. "I know." "I said it more than once." "Yes." He looked up at her. He was 62 years old and had been farming this county his whole life and was tired in the way that long-time farmers get tired. Not defeated, but carrying a weight that never quite comes off. "I'm sorry, Norma." She reached across the table and put her hand on his for a moment, the way his sister would have, the way Stuart would have wanted her to. "You thought you were being practical," she said. "You weren't wrong to be concerned. You were just looking at the wrong numbers." He laughed, short, a little rough. "The wrong numbers. The short-term numbers. I was looking at the 15-year numbers." She got up to put the kettle on. "There's a difference." The years after 1985 were different in ways that were difficult to explain to people who hadn't watched the previous 11 years. The farm hadn't changed dramatically. The wheat was still there, the hives were still there, the margins were blooming in the same sequence they'd been blooming since she planted them in those quiet early morning hours when no one was watching. But something had settled in the way people talked about the farm or didn't talk about it. A silence where the jokes and the concern had been, and in its place, something more like respect. The Ottawa distributor doubled his order in 1986. A magazine in Toronto wrote a short piece about the farm's honey and mentioned the university study, and for a few months she got letters from people she'd never met, beekeepers and farmers, and a few hobby apiarists who wanted to know about the planting mix. She wrote back to all of them. She had always answered letters. Her daughter Ellen, who by then was working at Environment Canada and had developed her own professional interest in habitat corridors, came home for a long weekend in the summer of 1986 and walked the margins with her mother and said very little for a long time, and then said, "Mom, I keep thinking about what this looked like in 1974, just wheat fields and ditch grass." "It wasn't even good ditch grass," Norma said. "And you saw this." "I saw what it could be." She paused, looking out over the goldenrod coming into early bloom along the creek. "Your grandmother saw it first, really. She just didn't know this particular piece of land." They stood there in the summer quiet, somewhere in the middle distance, invisible and audible and absolutely necessary. 40,000 bees were doing the oldest work in the world. In 1988, Norma was invited to speak at a regional agricultural conference in Renfrew. Not a large event, not a prestigious one. Just farmers and extension workers and a few researchers gathered in the church hall on a Saturday morning. She spoke for 20 minutes about what she had done and why she had done it, and what the numbers look like at the end of 15 years. She used no notes. She spoke the way she did everything, directly, specifically, without ornamentation. When she finished, Colin Marsh, who was sitting in the third row and had aged considerably since the days when he told her bees on a wheat farm was a misunderstanding of geography, stood up before the moderator could open the floor and said, "I should have listened to you in 1974. She looked at him. The room was quiet. "Maybe in 1978 I would have," he said. "Certainly by 1982. I should have come and looked at what you were actually doing instead of deciding I already knew." There wasn't much to say to that. She thanked him. She meant it. On the drive home, on the same county road she had driven in the spring of 1974, with the windows down and the smell of turned earth coming up from the ditches, Norma Calloway thought about her grandmother standing at the kitchen window in Queenston with a jar of pale gold honey held up to the light, turning it slowly the way you look at something you've made from patience and from paying attention. Some things take a long time to prove themselves. That doesn't make them wrong from the beginning. It makes them the kind of right that most people can't see until it's already standing there in front of them, undeniable and in full bloom on a wheat farm in Ontario, in a year when the rest of the county was finally, beginning to understand what she had known all along. I think about Norma Calloway standing at the edge of that creek in late August, goldenrod thick on both sides, 40,000 bees working the margins she'd planted year by year, and I wonder how many people have a version of that moment somewhere in their life, a thing they knew was right, long before anyone else was willing to see it. What strikes me most about her story isn't the vindication, it's the quality of her attention. She didn't start with a grand vision. She started with a ledger, a letter from a beekeeper in Fraser Valley, and the memory of her grandmother holding a jar of honey up to a window. She looked at what she actually had, the clover, the creek margins, the canola across the road, and she asked a different question than everyone else was asking. That kind of clear-eyed thinking, the willingness to look at the same piece of land and see what others have decided isn't there. That's not luck. That's something you practice, something you build. And then there's the matter of doing it anyway, for 11 years, while people you respect tell you it won't work. Aldous wasn't cruel. Colin Marsh wasn't malicious. They were practical men saying practical things, and in a community that had always farmed a certain way, practical and familiar can feel like the same word. What Norma understood and what took everyone else 11 years to catch up to is that being genuinely practical means being willing to look further out than the next season. The short-term numbers and the 15-year numbers are not the same document. She was reading the second one while everyone else was reading the first. I find myself thinking about the 11 hives she lost in 1978. She restocked in May. She didn't explain herself to Aldous when he came with the pie. She just told him the truth. 57 left, back in spring, and let the facts speak without drama. That kind of steadiness, the refusal to be undone by a hard year, isn't stubbornness. It's something closer to honest character, knowing what you stand for well enough that a setback doesn't rewrite the story you're living. The thing about cause and effect is that it works on a longer timeline than we usually want it to. Norma planted the phacelia and the wild bergamot and the goldenrod, and she documented the bloom times, and she kept writing to people who wrote back with useful things, and she kept the ledger honestly. None of that was dramatic. None of it looked like anything from the road. But every one of those choices was a cause. In 1985, the paper, the conference, Colin Marsh standing up in the third row, that was the effect. Effects that size take that long to arrive. What I carry from her story is something like this. The people who change things quietly are usually the ones who were paying attention when no one else thought it was worth paying attention to. Norma Calloway didn't win by being louder or more insistent. She won by being more honest. About the land, about the numbers, about what was actually possible if you were willing to wait and watch and keep doing the work. That's a kind of integrity that doesn't require an audience, and in the end, it doesn't need one.